A single gunshot shattered the freezing valley's silence, showering Florian Klingelhofer's polished leather boots with jagged splinters from the porch. Next one goes through your heart. Mahulena Cruz roared from the shadows of the rotting cabin, her grandfather's Winchester smoking in her trembling hands. Florian didn't flinch. He merely signaled his enforcer, Mons Domingo. The old man left her nothing but firewood. Burn her out and take the land. They mocked the desperate girl, defending a decaying shack. They had no idea that the real threat was already waiting for them, entombed beneath the floorboards. Frost clung to the skeletal branches of the pines surrounding Telluride, a stark reminder that the brutal Colorado winter was rapidly closing its grip on the territory. It was 1888, an era when silver veins bled unimaginable wealth into the pockets of valley barons, leaving nothing but broken dreams for the common folk. While the booming town below glittered with gaslight, sudden fortunes, and cutthroat ambition, Mahulena Cruz stood isolated on a desolate, wind-scoured ridge, the inheritor of a rotting, dilapidated shack that seemed entirely forgotten by the prosperous age. Standing in the shadow of the sagging spruce roof, Mahulena pulled her woven wool shawl tighter around her slender shoulders. The cabin was a miserable sight. Its ponderosa pine logs were gray and splintering, the chinking crumbling into fine white dust with every gust of wind. The window panes, those that weren't shattered and patched with oilcloth, were thick with decades of grime. To anyone else, it was an eyesore, a monument to a stubborn old man's failure. But to Mahulena, it was the last tether to her grandfather, a man who had died with nothing but a fierce, unspoken secret in his chest. "You shouldn't be out in this chill, child," a soft, raspy voice called out. Mahulena turned to see Teresita Erickson navigating the rutted dirt path. Teresita was a woman carved from the harsh Colorado landscape itself, her face lined with years of sun and sorrow, her hands calloused from decades of laundering clothes for the miners at the Smuggler Union mine. She carried a basket of dried venison and hardtack, her eyes filled with a maternal warmth that momentarily chased away the freezing mountain air. "I can't go inside just yet, Teresita," Mahulena replied, her voice trembling not from the cold, but from a deep, simmering anger. "Not while his stench still lingers on the porch." Teresita sighed, setting the basket on a relatively stable stump. She knew exactly who Mahulena meant. Earlier that morning, the valley's most ruthless land baron, Florian Klingelhofer, had ridden out from his opulent brick mansion in town. Klingelhofer was a man who smelled of bay rum, imported tobacco, and unchecked greed. He wore tailored wool suits from Chicago and a pristine white Stetson Boss of the Plains hat that had never seen a hard day's work. Alongside him rode his personal enforcer and the county's corrupt deputy assessor, Mons Domingo, a man with cold, dead eyes and a pair of pearl-handled Colt 45s strapped to his hips. They had arrived with a sneer and an insulting offer of $50, barely enough to buy a ticket on the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad out of the territory. Klingelhofer had mocked her grandfather's memory, claiming the old man was a lunatic who had squatted on worthless dirt. When Mahulena refused, Mons Domingo had casually placed a hand on his revolver, promising that dry pine burned incredibly well in the autumn winds. "Florian Klingelhofer is a vulture, Mahulena," Teresita said softly, stepping closer to wrap a comforting arm around the younger woman. "He has bought out every struggling claim from here to Ouray. But why he wants this miserable patch of rock is a mystery to me. There's no gold here. The assayers proved that 20 years ago. It's not about gold," Mahulena whispered, staring at the scarred wooden door of the cabin. "It's about control. Grandfather always said Florian was stealing the valley blind, bearing the truth under legal paper and threats. He died before he could prove it." Teresita squeezed her shoulder. "Your grandfather was a good man, but his mind wandered in his final years. Don't let your grief turn into a war you cannot win. Florian has the judges in his pocket and an army of Pinkerton men at his call. $50 is an insult, but it might buy you a new life in Denver." Mahulena pulled away gently, her dark eyes flashing with a sudden, unyielding resolve. I am not running, Teresita. If this cabin is so worthless, why did Florian ride out here himself? Why did Mons Domingo threaten to burn me out? There is something they want. And before I let them strike a match to this place, I will tear it apart board by board. As Teresita left, murmuring prayers for the stubborn girl, Mahulena stepped onto the porch. The floorboards groaned in protest beneath her worn leather boots. She didn't know it yet, but that very groan was the voice of the cabin, preparing to yield a secret that would shake the Colorado territory to its core. Night descended on Telluride, with the swift brutality of a falling axe. The temperature plummeted, and the surrounding ponderosa pines began to snap and pop in the freezing air. Inside the drafty cabin, Mahulena lit a single kerosene lantern. The amber light flickered across the sparse furnishings: a rusted cast-iron stove, a cot piled with heavy Navajo blankets, and a scarred oak table where her grandfather had spent countless nights scribbling in his notebooks. She was boiling a pot of chicory coffee when a sharp, rhythmic knocking at the heavy oak door startled her. She instinctively reached for the Winchester Model 1873 leaning against the wall, jacking a brass cartridge into the chamber with a loud metallic clack. "Who's there?" she called out, leveling the barrel at the center of the door. "Put the cannon away, Mahulena." "It's Mariuka," a hushed, urgent voice replied. Mahulena unlatched the heavy iron bolt. Mariuka Latushek slipped inside, bringing a gust of freezing wind with her. Mariuka was the town's telegraph operator, a sharp-witted woman who knew every secret that pulsed across the copper wires between Telluride and Denver. She was out of breath, her cheeks flushed red beneath her heavy woolen bonnet. "You need to be careful, Mahulena," Mariuka gasped, holding her hands over the iron stove to catch the radiant heat. "I just intercepted a wire from Florian to a judge in Durango. He's filing an emergency writ to condemn this property by the end of the week. He told the judge the cabin is a public hazard and a blight on the new railroad spur he's proposing." Mahulena frowned, lowering the rifle. "A railroad spur? Here? That makes no sense. The grade is too steep, and there's no ore up this ridge." "That's exactly what I thought," Mariuka said, her eyes wide with conspiratorial excitement. "Florian is lying. He's desperate to get you off this land before the weekend. And Mons Domingo was in the saloon, boasting that if the judge takes too long, he'll just let a stray spark handle the eviction." "They are terrified," Mahulena realized, her gaze slowly drifting across the dusty floor. "Grandfather knew something. He hid something." Mariuka nodded briskly. "I must get back before my shift ends, or Florian's men will notice I'm gone. Keep your rifle loaded, Mahulena." After Mariuka slipped back into the night, Mahulena was left alone with the deafening silence of the cabin. She began to pace, her boots echoing hollowly against the wide planked floor. She thought about her grandfather's final days. He had been delirious, gripping her hands with surprising strength, whispering feverishly about the foundation and the roots of the rot. She had assumed he was talking about the corruption in the town. But as she walked past the heavy oak table, the toe of her boot caught on the edge of a thick, braided rag rug that had lain in the center of the room for as long as she could remember. She stumbled, catching herself on the back of a chair. Looking down, she noticed that the rug, usually flat, had bunched up, revealing a section of floorboard that looked subtly different from the rest. The grain was perpendicular. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs. She dropped to her knees, pushing the heavy rug completely aside. The wood here was relatively free of dust, and as she ran her calloused fingers along the seams, she felt a distinct, unnatural gap. Mahulena fetched a heavy iron fire poker from the stove. She jammed the flattened end into the crack and pried with all her strength. The ancient iron nails shrieked as they were pulled from the joists. With a violent crack, a 3-foot section of the floorboard popped up. Beneath it was not the dirt she expected, but a heavy iron ring set into a reinforced oak trapdoor. She stared at it, her breath pluming in the cold cabin air. Florian Klingelhofer thought this place was worthless. He thought her grandfather was a fool. She grabbed the iron ring, bracing her boots on the solid floor, and pulled. The hinges, slick with well-preserved axle grease, gave way silently. The trapdoor swung open, exhaling a breath of dry, ancient air that smelled of canvas, aged paper, and the metallic tang of oiled steel. The floorboards hadn't just groaned. They had opened the gates to hell for Florian Klingelhofer. The darkness beneath the trapdoor was absolute, a void that seemed to swallow the dim light from the cabin above. Mahulena knew she couldn't explore it alone. If Mons Domingo decided to make good on his threat tonight, she couldn't be trapped underground. She needed someone strong, someone who hated Florian Klingelhofer as much as she did. By dawn, she had sent a message through Teresita, and within the hour, Nani Rios arrived. Nani was a towering figure, a blacksmith by trade, with arms like braided steel cables and a heart that belonged to the working folks of Telluride. He carried a heavy canvas bag of tools and a pair of customized Colt revolvers tucked into his worn leather belt. "Teresita said you found a ghost down here," Nani said, his deep voice rumbling as he peered into the open square in the floor. "Maybe more than a ghost, Nani," Mahulena said, handing him a freshly lit kerosene lantern. "Let's go down." Nani descended first, his heavy boots finding solid wooden stairs built right into the earth. Mahulena followed, the trapdoor left open above them to allow fresh air. As Nani raised the lantern, the golden light spilled across the hidden space, and both of them stopped dead in their tracks, paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of what they were seeing. This was no simple root cellar. It was a massive, subterranean vault, shored up by thick timber supports, identical to those used in the deepest levels of the Campbird mine. The air was bone dry. Stacked against the far wall were a dozen heavy wooden crates, stamped with faded military insignias and the unmistakable seal of the Union Army. Nani walked over, using a crowbar from his bag to pry the lid off the nearest crate. The sound of splintering wood echoed loudly. Nani reached in, pushing aside dry straw, and pulled out a heavy, rectangular bar. Even in the dim light, the dull, hypnotic gleam of solid gold was unmistakable. "Madre de Dios," Nani breathed, the heavy bar trembling in his massive hand. "This is the lost payroll shipment from 64. The one they said was ambushed by Confederate sympathizers." "Look," Mahulena said, her voice shaking. She was pointing to the opposite wall. There, stacked like cordwood, were rows of canvas sacks stamped with the assayer's mark of the richest silver veins in the territory. But it wasn't the unimaginable wealth that drew Mahulena's eye. In the center of the room sat a massive, steel-banded Mosler safe, its door sitting slightly ajar. She rushed to it, pulling the heavy steel door open completely. Inside were no coins or jewels, but stacks of leather-bound ledgers, stacks of telegraph transcripts, and bundles of property deeds tied with red ribbon. Mahulena pulled the top ledger out and opened it beneath the lantern light. The handwriting was her grandfather's, precise and meticulous. It was a comprehensive, undeniable record of decades of corruption. Her grandfather had tracked every stolen claim, every forged signature, every judge that Florian Klingelhofer had bribed. He had gathered the original, unaltered land grants from the Spanish territorial days, proving that Florian's entire empire, the mines, the railroad rights, the very land the town of Telluride sat upon, was fraudulently acquired. And the gold? The ledger explained that too. Her grandfather had found the lost Union gold decades ago in a collapsed cave and had been using single bars to secretly fund a legal war in Washington, D.C., bypassing the corrupt local courts. Florian hadn't known about the gold, but he had suspected the old man was gathering evidence. "He wasn't crazy," Mahulena whispered, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks. "He was a hunter, and he spent 20 years building a cage for Florian." Nani looked from the gold to the ledgers, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. "Florian thinks he's buying a worthless cabin, If he knew what was down here, he'd bring an army. He doesn't have to know, Mahulena said, her grief solidifying into a cold, lethal determination. She carefully packed the ledgers into a canvas sack. Mariuka said he wanted to burn me out tonight. Let him come. We aren't selling, Nani. We are going to bury him. The sun began its slow descent behind the jagged peaks of the San Juans, bleeding a deep, bruised purple across the valley sky. The shadows, stretching over Telluride, grew long and sharp. Down in the heart of town, safely removed from the biting mountain wind, the opulent, mahogany-paneled office of the Klingelhofer Mining Corporation was suffocatingly warm. A roaring fire crackled in the marble hearth, casting dancing golden light across imported Persian rugs and walls lined with leather-bound legal volumes. Florian Klingelhofer stood at a towering window, looking out over the town he effectively owned, and poured himself a generous measure of expensive Kentucky bourbon from a heavy crystal decanter. His hand was remarkably steady, betraying none of the gnawing, icy anxiety that had been twisting in his gut all day. Mons Domingo lounged nearby in a green leather wingback chair. The air around him smelled sharply of gun oil and stale cigar smoke. He was methodically cleaning his pearl-handled Colt .45 with a soiled rag, turning the cylinder so it clicked in a hypnotic, deadly rhythm. The judge in Durango is stalling, Florian said, taking a slow sip of the amber liquid. His eyes were cold and calculating as they tracked a miner's wagon moving through the mud below. He sent a wire this afternoon. Says without physical proof of a structural hazard or an active public health threat, he can't sign the writ of condemnation until Monday morning. There are suddenly too many federal marshals sniffing around the territory for him to bend the law blindly. Man snapped the cylinder of his revolver shut with a sharp flick of his thick wrist. I told you, boss. The law is a slow, stupid beast. It only works when you hold the reins tight. Give me 4 men. We ride up there right at dusk. A lantern gets knocked over a tragic, unavoidable accident caused by a careless girl in a crumbling shack. She perishes in the blaze. The structure is reduced to ash, and the land automatically reverts to the county as a vacant, tax-delinquent lot. You buy it for pennies at the auction on Tuesday morning. Florian swirled his bourbon, his gaze drifting up toward the distant, darkened ridge where the cabin sat like a splinter in his eye. He hated that old man, Mahulena's grandfather. He had hated the way the old man used to look at him in town, not with the cowering fear of the other locals, but with the patient, quiet amusement of a man holding a royal flush. Florian didn't know exactly what the old man had hidden up on that worthless ridge, but his instincts, the very predatory instincts that had built his empire, screamed that it was dangerous to let the girl stay there another night. Do it, Florian commanded, his voice smooth and devoid of any moral hesitation. But I want no mistakes, mans. None. If she escapes that fire, if she makes it to the federal marshals in Denver with whatever the old man left her, we are both ruined. Little did Florian know, the machinery of his ruin was already in motion. The federal marshals were not in Denver. They were already screaming down the tracks toward Telluride. Up at the cabin, the wind had escalated from a howl to a shrieking gale, tearing at the loose chinking and rattling the fragile window panes. But inside, a quiet, hyper-focused intensity had taken over. Preparations for a siege were well underway. Teresita had arrived an hour earlier, her face pale but set in lines of furious determination. She had braved the frozen, treacherous trail with her small mule wagon, bringing not just food, but heavy wooden crates of 44 to 40 Winchester ammunition, carefully hidden beneath thick wool blankets. If they want to burn this place, they'll have to walk through a wall of lead to do it, Teresita muttered, stacking the brass cartridges on the oak table with trembling, yet precise, hands. Mariuka had risked everything to ride up just before dusk, her horse lathered in freezing sweat. She brought the triumphant, adrenaline-fueled news. I managed to wire the district attorney in Denver directly, Mariuka said, pacing the floorboards to keep warm, her breath pluming in the air. I bypassed the local relay office completely, so Florian's men couldn't intercept or delay it. The DA didn't hesitate. Federal marshals boarded a special Denver and Rio Grande locomotive an hour ago. They have the right-of-way on the tracks. They will be in Telluride by midnight. We just have to hold them off until the train arrives, Nani grunted. He was using a heavy iron mallet to drive thick iron spikes into the doorframe, reinforcing the barricade they had created by shoving the heavy oak table against the front door. He checked the action on his revolvers, the metallic clicks echoing loudly in the tense silence. Mans Domingo is a bully, a backshooter. Bullies like easy prey. They won't expect to fight. Mahulena stood by the shattered front window, peering out through a narrow, jagged gap in the oilcloth. She had donned her grandfather's heavy canvas hunting coat. It smelled of ancient pine needles, tobacco, and memories, giving her a strange, comforting strength. The pockets were heavily weighted down with the spare cartridges Teresita had brought. The rusted Winchester she had wielded that morning was no longer rusted. Nani had stripped, cleaned, and heavily oiled the weapon until the dark steel gleamed. She felt the vibrations before she heard them. "They are coming," Mahulena said quietly, her thumb resting lightly on the Winchester's hammer. The sound drifted up the mountain path, the rhythmic, thunderous thud of horse hooves striking the frozen, unforgiving dirt. Through the gathering twilight, Mahulena counted the dark silhouettes. 5 riders. At the front was Mans Domingo, holding a heavy pitch-soaked torch that spit orange embers into the freezing wind. But as her eyes adjusted to the gloom, her breath hitched. Riding slightly behind Mans, wrapped tightly in a luxurious, fur-lined coat, was Florian Klingelhofer himself. His monumental arrogance wouldn't let him stay behind in the warmth of his office. He wanted to personally watch his final problem turn to ash. "Teresita, Mariuka, get down into the basement," Mahulena ordered, her voice eerily calm, stripped of all the grief she had felt that morning. "Do not come up until I say so, no matter what you hear." As the women hurried down the trapdoor, pulling it shut above them, Mahulena cocked the lever of the Winchester. A heavy brass shell slid into the chamber. Nani took his position by the rear window, drawing both Colts. The vultures had arrived, expecting a carcass. They were about to step into a bear trap. The riders halted 30 yards from the cabin porch. The torchlight illuminated the cruel smirk on Mans Domingo's face and the haughty impatience of Florian Klingelhofer. The 3 hired guns flanked them, their rifles resting casually across their saddles. "Mahulena Cruz." Florian's voice cut through the howling wind, smooth and condescending. "I am a reasonable man. The judge has signed the order. You are trespassing on condemned land. Come out now, and I will personally ensure you are escorted to the train station with your $50. Mahulena kicked the door barricade aside, just enough to open the heavy oak door a few inches. She stepped half out onto the porch, keeping her body shielded by the thick timber doorframe. The Winchester was raised, the stock pressed firmly into her shoulder. "There is no order, Florian," she yelled back. "And you wouldn't be out here freezing in the dirt if you weren't terrified of what my grandfather left me." Florian's face darkened. "Burn it," he hissed to Mans. Mans Domingo spurred his horse forward, rearing his arm back to hurl the flaming torch onto the dry pine roof. Mahulena didn't hesitate. She exhaled slowly, aligned the iron sights of the Winchester with the glowing torch, and squeezed the trigger. Crack. The heavy 44-40 bullet shattered the wooden handle of the torch midair. It exploded in a shower of sparks and flaming pitch, raining down on Mans Domingo's horse. The animal shrieked, bucking wildly, and throwing Mans hard into the frozen dirt. "Kill her!" Florian screamed, scrambling to pull his own silver-plated derringer from his coat as his horse danced in panic. The hired guns raised their rifles, but before they could fire, the cabin erupted in a deafening barrage. From the rear window, Nani Rios opened up with his twin Colts, a terrifying display of rapid, suppressing fire. Bullets chewed into the dirt around the riders' horses, sending splinters flying from the trees behind them. 2 of the hired men, realizing they were facing heavy resistance and not a helpless girl, turned their horses and fled into the dark tree line. Mons Domingo groaned, rolling behind a large pine stump for cover. He drew his pearl-handled revolvers, firing blindly toward the porch. Wood shards exploded near Mahulena's face, cutting her cheek. She didn't flinch. She pumped the lever of the Winchester, firing back with methodical, terrifying precision, pinning Mans down. "You're a dead woman, Cruz," Mans yelled over the gunfire. "You think you can fight us? We own this town." "You own nothing," Mahulena shouted. She reached into her heavy coat pocket and pulled out a handful of papers copies she had hastily made from the ledgers. With a fierce throw, she cast them into the wind. The pages scattered, fluttering like dead leaves over the battlefield, landing near Mans' stump and Florian's horse. "Read them, Mans," she yelled. "Those are the real deeds, and my grandfather's ledgers, every bribe, every murder. He wrote down how Florian planned to pin the San Miguel mine collapse on you to keep his own hands clean." Mans Domingo paused, his finger easing off the trigger. He grabbed a fluttering page from the dirt. Even in the dim light of the scattered embers, he could read Florian's immaculate signature, authorizing a payoff to the coroner to blame Mans for a massacre. Florian saw Mans reading. Panic, pure and unadulterated, finally broke through his arrogant veneer. "Don't listen to her, Mans. Shoot her. I'll pay you $10,000. But the dynamic had shifted. The cabin wasn't worthless. The girl wasn't helpless. And Florian's empire of lies was crumbling in the freezing mud. Mans Domingo slowly stood up from behind the stump. He didn't aim his weapon at the cabin. Instead, the heavy barrel of his Colt swung slowly until it pointed directly at the chest of Florian Klingelhofer. $10,000, Mans spat, the betrayal burning in his eyes. "You were going to let me hang for the San Miguel job." "Mans, put the gun down," Florian stammered, his silver spurs jingling as he backed his horse away. The arrogant land baron was suddenly looking very small, a terrified rat caught in the open. "She forged those. It's a trick." "It's no trick, Florian." A booming, authoritative voice echoed from the darkness of the mountain path behind them. Out of the gloom rode a contingent of 10 men, their badges gleaming in the moonlight. Leading them was U.S. Marshal Ezekiel Vance, a legendary lawman from Denver, holding a Winchester repeater leveled at Florian's head. Beside the marshal rode Mariuka Latashek, who had slipped out the back of the basement during the firefight to guide them up the trail. "Florian Klingelhofer," Marshal Vance called out, his voice like grinding stone. "I hold a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of land fraud, extortion, and the murder of 18 minors. Drop the weapon." Florian looked at the marshals. He looked at Mons Domingo, who still had a gun trained on him. Finally, he looked at Mahulena, who stepped off the porch, the bleeding cut on her cheek a badge of honor. The sheer, crushing weight of karma had arrived. Florian dropped his derringer into the mud. He raised his hands, his expensive Chicago suit suddenly looking like a clown's costume. Mans Domingo lowered his gun, surrendering to the deputies with a weary sigh, knowing he would trade his testimony for his life. As the deputies slapped heavy iron cuffs on Florian, dragging the screaming, protesting baron from his horse, Mahulena lowered her rifle. The war was over. Within weeks, the territory of Colorado was turned upside down. The ledgers from the basement served as an ironclad guillotine, severing Florian's control over Telluride. The fraudulent deeds were reversed. Miners who had been driven into poverty had their claims restored. The Union gold was turned over to the federal government, but, as a reward for its recovery, Mahulena was granted 10% of its value, a staggering fortune that made her one of the wealthiest women in the West. But Mahulena didn't build a brick mansion in town. Instead, she used the money to tear down the rotting pine of her grandfather's cabin, building a sprawling, beautiful ranch house over the very same foundation. The basement remained, no longer a tomb of secrets, but a cellar for aging fine wines and storing the bountiful harvests of a land finally at peace. Teresita no longer washed clothes. She managed the estate's staff, Nani Rios expanded his blacksmith forge with state-of-the-art tools, and Mariuka became the chief telegraph officer for the entire county. One crisp autumn morning, Mahulena stood on her wide wraparound porch, looking out at the San Juan Mountains. The valley was thriving. She touched the smooth, polished wood of her grandfather's Winchester, now mounted proudly above the front door. They had thought the cabin was worthless. They had thought she was weak, but Mahulena knew the truth. The strongest foundations are often hidden in the dark, just waiting for the light. The story of Mahulena Cruz reminds us that true value often lies hidden beneath a weathered surface, waiting for the right heart to uncover it. In our own lives, we are frequently quick to judge people, opportunities, or circumstances based purely on their outward appearance. Yet, just like that forgotten cabin in the San Juan Mountains, our greatest treasures, resilience, truth, and vindication, are usually found in the deepest, darkest basements of our struggles. Arrogance and greed will always meet their reckoning, while patience and courage ultimately yield the richest rewards. Never let anyone devalue your worth or tell you that your foundation is broken. Stand tall, protect your truth, and let karma handle the rest. If this story of justice and hidden strength resonated with you, please hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their inner worth, and subscribe for more thrilling tales